In 1991, the Soviet Union was disintegrating, and the Communist Party in Yugoslavia was collapsing. Yugoslavia, a federation comprising 6 countries, was experiencing internal strife. The economy was in shambles, and nationalism, which fed on ethnic and religious disparities, supplanted communism. By the conclusion of the year, Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia had all declared their independence. While Macedonia's secession was peaceful, Slovenia and Croatia had to wage wars to break away from Yugoslavia. However, Serbia, which was mainly inhabited by Christian Serbs, was not willing to allow Yugoslavia to fall apart entirely. They joined forces with Montenegro to establish a successor state to Yugoslavia, since they held the most influence in the country and constituted the bulk of the Yugoslav army. Their aim was not to create independent states, but to hold on to their majority in power. Bosnia and Herzegovina, another country in the disintegrating federation, was the Socialist Republic, and nearly half of its population comprised Bosnian Muslims, Bosniaks, while around a third were Christian Serbs, like those in Bosnia. The remaining 17% were Croats. For a considerable time, these factions coexisted peacefully, sharing a common belief in communism and the Yugoslav idea. However, with the creation of new nations, no group wished to end up in a new state controlled by the other. Thus, in late 1991, a predominantly Croat region declared itself an independent state from Bosnia, but it wasn't internationally recognized. While some Croat leaders sought to secede entirely from the country, they initially agreed to cooperate with the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, functioning as a state within a state. The following year, Bosnia conducted an independence referendum, with 63% of the population turning out and 99% of the voters choosing independence from Yugoslavia. These figures indicate that most Bosniaks voted in favor, while the Bosnian Serbs boycotted the vote, opposing becoming a minority in a new Bosnia. After the independence referendum passed, the Bosnian Serbs proclaimed their own state within Bosnia's borders, named Republika Srpska. Except for one country, Serbia and Montenegro, no one acknowledged this self-proclaimed nation. It was at this point that Slobodan Milosevic, a significant figure in the story, became Serbia's leader and acknowledged the new Serb state within Bosnia, marking the start of the Bosnian War. Top of form. Before we proceed, it is essential to revisit Serbia and its leader Milosevic. He was a fervent nationalist who built his career by inflaming ethnic tensions among Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks. He perceived these tensions as an opportunity to realize his vision of creating a new and larger Serbian nation across the former Yugoslavia. It's worth noting that Serbia was the location of the former Yugoslav capital, and the Yugoslav army was predominantly composed of Serbs. Therefore, Milosevic could deploy this professional army to support the Serbians in Bosnia in establishing their fresh territorial claim. To resist the Serb forces, Bosniaks and Croats joined forces to bolster their chances of achieving independence. However, the Serbs have a formidable professional army, which they swiftly deploy to surround the Bosnian capital city. They position tanks, artillery, and snipers on the hills around the city, cutting off supply routes and blocking roads. Their primary objective is to take the capital as quickly as possible and end the war. They engage in indiscriminate firing, attacking civilians with tanks, artillery, and sniper fire, killing thousands in a siege that lasts for years. Although the majority of the city's population was Bosniak, it also included Croats and Serbs, but the Serbs launched attacks anyway. The UN intervenes rapidly and attempted to negotiate with Milosevic and the Serb forces. They swiftly reach an agreement for the Yugoslav army to withdraw. However, what transpires is that the Yugoslav army relinquishes control of around 100,000 Serb troops, who mostly continue fighting for the Serbs in Bosnia. As the Yugoslav forces withdraw from Sarajevo as part of the agreement, they are attacked by Bosniak troops, resulting in the death of an unknown number of Yugoslav army personnel. War crime charges would later be levied against Bosnian commanders for this attack. As the war intensifies, Serbs ramp up their brutality across the country, systematically identifying Bosniak homes and ransacking and burning them down. They separate civilians into men and women, sending the men to concentration camps or executing them. while women are sent to prisons where they suffer abuse and human rights violations. The groups in Bosnia, especially the Serbs, are now engaging in what appears to be an ethnic cleansing campaign. Despite this, the international community remains reluctant to take more drastic action, resorting to economic sanctions and sending only food, medicine, and peacekeeping troops. While the UN does attempt to stop the flow of weapons into the conflict, they primarily adhere to peacekeeping principles, allowing the Serbs to continue their advance and their brutal actions. However, the situation in Bosnia continues to deteriorate, with the alliance between the Bosniaks and Croats breaking down, leading to a conflict between them as well. The Croats capture portions of the city of Mostar, which they had previously defended alongside the Bosniaks, and begin attacking and killing Bosniak civilians. As conditions worsen, the UN calls for NATO forces to enforce a no-fly zone, but this does little to stop the escalating ethnic cleansing happening on the ground. The UN attempts to protect civilians fleeing the war by establishing safe zones across the country the following year, particularly for Bosniaks who are fleeing ethnic cleansing by the Serb army. However, the UN's effectiveness depends on the willingness of its member nations to commit troops to defend these safe zones, which turns out to be limited. As a result, Serb forces regularly attack civilians in the safe zone. Although the United States initially tries to stay out of the war, it eventually helps broker a peace deal between the Croats and the Bosniaks, which ends the war within the war. The agreement is signed in March of 1994, re-establishing the Federal Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and more importantly, renewing the alliances to fight against the Serbs. In 1994, there were some gradual changes in the situation. The Bosnian Serbs rejected a peace agreement proposed by the UN. As a result, Milosevic, who was feeling the effects of being cut off from the global economy, broke ties with the Bosnian Serbs. He refused to send them more weapons and funds, as he wanted to remain in power and control his new Yugoslavia. Milosevic hoped that cutting ties with the Bosnian Serbs, who were committing terrible acts, would persuade the West to resume training with him. With Milosevic withdrawing his support, the Bosnian Serbs continued their horrific campaign of violence throughout the country. However, the Bosniaks and Croats also began to engage in terrible violent acts against civilians. Meanwhile, as the conflict persisted, NATO continued to enforce its no-fly zone and became increasingly involved in the conflict as Serb forces became more aggressive. In 1995, former President Jimmy Carter intervenes in Bosnia and negotiates a temporary ceasefire that holds for a short while, but eventually breaks down as fighting resumes. During this time, Serb forces raid UN bases and steal weapons, using them to target unarmed civilians. In response, NATO increases airstrikes, leading to Serb forces taking UN peacekeepers hostage and even shooting down a US F-16 fighter jet. The Serb army has gained confidence and sets its sights on a final offensive to end the war and take control of the remaining UN safe zones, including Srebrenica, a town where almost 10,000 Bosniaks have sought refuge. On July 11, 1995, around 2,000 Serb soldiers entered the town and encountered no resistance from the 370 Dutch soldiers who were tasked with protecting the safe zone. The Dutch soldiers decide to remain neutral and focus on safeguarding supplies rather than protecting the Bosniak civilians. As a result, the Serb forces are able to capture and execute approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys in what is considered the deadliest genocide in Europe since World War II. Following the massacre at Srebrenica, the surviving refugees fled to other areas and shared the stories of the mass murder that occurred. While the UN report acknowledged that all sides violated the Geneva Conventions, it described the Serb offensive as systematic ethnic cleansing. Consequently, the United States could no longer stand by and watch the atrocities continue. In late 1995, the Clinton administration developed a new strategy that involved the eventual withdrawal of the UN from Bosnia, with the US and NATO assuming responsibility for the country's safety. The plan also included provisions for the US to send weapons to the Bosnian government. As part of this effort, the US proposed a peace plan that divided Bosnia into two entities, one for Serbs and one for Bosniaks. These regions would have some autonomy, with Bosniaks controlling 51% of the country. Both sides considered the US proposal, but the fighting persisted. However, With the international community backing them, the Croats launched a successful offensive in 1995 that reclaimed significant land from the Serbs. The Bosniaks also gained momentum in the war, causing the balance of power to shift and forcing the Serbs to return to the negotiating table. After several rounds of negotiations, the Dayton Accords were signed in December 1995 by the presidents of Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia. This agreement ultimately resulted in the current borders that divide Bosnia and Herzegovina into two entities. The Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina is mostly composed of Bosniaks and Bosnian Croats, while Republika Srpska is mostly made up of Bosnian Serbs. Although Republika Srpska is somewhat autonomous with its own political system and judiciary, it is still a part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, signifying the end of the war. Sadly, over 100,000 people lost their lives during the conflict, and millions were displaced, primarily Bosnian Muslims. The United Nations Tribunal prosecuted 161 individuals for their involvement in war crimes committed during the war. Slobodan Milosevic, who was found guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, was sentenced to life in prison but died before the end of his trial. The war cemented the ethnic divides that had led to the conflict, and although Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats now live in relative peace, the country still faces new threats to its stability, including rising nationalism, the glorification of former Serb war criminals, and calls for Serbian independence. The memories of the atrocities committed during the conflict continue to haunt the country, evident in the physical scars on the land and the psychological impact on its people. Alright, guys, that wraps up our video for today. We'll love to know your opinion on this historic war in the comments section below. Please do well to give this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more.